When Che Guevara was killed on October 9, 1967, something was missing. It was not his notebook or his map of tactical operations. His Rolex was missing and had not been seen in public since then. Where is it now, and who took it? You're just about to find out in today's episode about the most controversial watches in history. Now, before we talk about the watch, you need to understand the man. Ernesto Che Guevara was born in Argentina in 1928 into a middle-class family. He trained as a doctor, he was brilliant, athletic, and curious about the world around him. But what turned a medical student into one of the most feared revolutionaries of the 20th century? It was a motorcycle trip. Before completing his medical studies, his entire worldview was changed by the poverty he witnessed during a 9-month journey through Latin America. He saw people living in conditions that no textbook had prepared him for, and something in him decided that medicine alone wasn't enough, that the system itself needed to change. That belief took him to Cuba, where he met Fidel Castro, and where everything shifted. Guevara played a prominent role in the Cuban Revolution, through which Fidel Castro rose to power. He wasn't just a foot soldier, he was one of Castro's most trusted commanders in the Cuban revolutionary movement. In 1958, Castro rewarded his loyalty when Guevara proved himself on the battlefield by giving him a Rolex. But Guevara, being a man who preached against personal wealth and material excess, didn't keep it for long. Less than a year later, Guevara gave the watch to his father. However, in 1966, Castro gave him another one, and this time the story of that watch wouldn't just outlive them, but take the center stage of our story today. Now, it's worth understanding what this watch was before we go any further. Back in the 1950s and 60s, a mechanical Rolex wasn't a status symbol for a country club. It was an indestructible piece of survival gear. This was a world before digital screens, quartz batteries, or GPS tracking existed. If you were navigating a pitch-black jungle or timing a midnight ambush, a cheap watch that stopped ticking meant your entire squad could walk straight into a trap. At the time, a stainless steel Rolex retailed for roughly $200. It wasn't cheap, but people paid for its survival rate, not its prestige. The specific model Guevara wore through the mud was the Rolex GMT-Master reference 1675. Now, let me give you a backstory about this watch. In the mid-1950s, Pan American World Airways asked Rolex to design a cockpit watch that could track both Greenwich Mean Time and local time simultaneously. Pilots flying intercontinental routes needed to know 2 time zones at once, and doing that math in your head at 30,000 feet wasn't an option. Rolex answered with a GMT-Master reference 1675 in 1959. It had a thick 40mm stainless steel case, heavy crown guards, and a rotating Pepsi bezel split into red and blue halves. This was done to help pilots track 2 different time zones instantly. This legendary mechanical workhorse was built to take a beating and keep running through swamp water, heavy vibrations, and extreme tropical humidity. With its glowing dial markers and high contrast face, it was built for pure tactical utility. But behind the public curtain, something entirely different was happening with how these watches were distributed. As we earlier mentioned, Che Guevara didn't step into a luxury boutique to buy this watch, and he certainly wasn't trying to look wealthy. The watch was a personal gift from his commander-in-chief, Fidel Castro. Castro was utterly obsessed with Rolex, often wearing 2 of them on a single wrist, just to track the time in Havana and Moscow simultaneously. To the Cuban revolutionaries, these weren't luxury items. Rather, they were standard issue gear for top-ranking officers. When you're fighting a guerrilla war, synchronizing a multi-prong attack down to the exact second is everything. If one squad strikes 5 minutes too early, the entire operation collapses. Castro knew that Rolex built the most reliable mechanical instruments on Earth, so he bought them in batches to hand out to his inner circle as essential military equipment. But look closely at how this actually unfolded, and you notice something strange. Castro gave Guevara the GMT-Master right before he left Cuba for Bolivia. It was more of a farewell gift. He never knew that the final chapter of Guevara's life would turn a simple steel watch into a haunting piece of Cold War history. After holding several positions in Castro's government, Che Guevara disappeared from Cuba in 1965. He secretly traveled to the Congo, where he trained rebels, and in 1966 resurfaced in Bolivia as the leader of another guerrilla group. By this time, he had already fought revolutions on 2 continents. Bolivia was supposed to be the spark, the beginning of a continent-wide revolution that would sweep through Latin America and change history. That was the plan, but the plan fell apart almost immediately. Guevara was overconfident and tired after years of pursuing the revolution. He neglected core tenets of his own revolutionary theories. The local population didn't rise up. His tiny band of rebels was starving, and the CIA, which had been tracking his every movement, was closing in. Working directly with the Bolivian army was a man named Félix Rodríguez. Rodríguez was no ordinary agent. He was a Cuban exile, a man whose country had been taken over by the revolution that Guevara helped build. He had spent years hunting Guevara through the jungles of Bolivia. His primary mission was to find Guevara, pull him out of the jungle, and end the uprising. On October 8, 1967, after a chaotic firefight, Guevara was finally captured and dragged into a makeshift mud schoolhouse in the tiny village of La Higuera. He was wounded and exhausted, but the steel Rolex GMT-Master was still ticking perfectly on his wrist. Félix Rodríguez spent hours inside that room, talking with the legendary revolutionary. As they discussed the war and the failures of the rebellion, the steel watch sat between them. The next day, on October 9, 1967, the execution order arrived from the highest levels of the Bolivian government. But here's the twist that changes the entire meaning of that moment. Right before Guevara was led out to face the firing squad, Rodríguez stepped forward, reached down, unstrapped the Rolex from Guevara's wrist. He also told him, "You're going to die." Guevara looked straight back at him and said, "It's better this way. I should never have been captured alive." Moments later, the shots echoed through the valley and Che Guevara was dead. However, what happened next completely changed the timeline of his legacy. So don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel as we take you along this journey. With Guevara gone, a strange phenomenon began to sweep across the globe. Almost overnight, his face became a massive commercial powerhouse. The picture of Guevara in his beret was printed on millions of posters, flags, and mass-produced t-shirts. He became the symbol for anti-establishment youth, communism, and the rejection of Western capitalism. While all this was going on, something different was happening in America. Félix Rodríguez had returned to the United States, bringing his battlefield souvenir with him. The stainless steel Rolex GMT-Master was no longer hidden in a Bolivian jungle. It was now a prized possession in the hands of a CIA operative. But here's the underlying reality that rarely gets mentioned. The irony of this story is staggering. Can you believe that the most famous communist revolutionary in human history spent his final years wearing a symbol of Western luxury and wealth? Whenever people saw the scratch-resistant steel case on his wrist, they weren't just looking at a beautiful Swiss timepiece. They were looking at a trophy that verified the downfall of a global threat. Interestingly, Rodríguez didn't hide the watch in a dark box. He was often seen proudly showing it to reporters in the years that followed, as if the watch itself was proof that the revolution had an ending, or the man on a million t-shirts had been found and stopped. Regardless, one question that the watch world has spent the last 6 decades asking is, where does a watch like that go? After that October morning in 1967, the GMT-Master disappeared from public view. You know, when Che Guevara was killed, CIA operative Félix Rodríguez removed it from the wrist of his corpse, so the watch remains in his possession to this day. It's never been assigned a formal dollar value by an auction house, neither has it been bid on or even appraised. It is, for all intents and purposes, entirely priceless. But that hasn't stopped the watch world from trying to calculate what a piece of that watch is worth. Today, a standard vintage Rolex GMT-Master reference 1675 from the 1960s is already a highly coveted collector's item. It commands tens of thousands of dollars based on its condition alone. But when you look at how the market responds to watches with military or political provenance, this math changes completely. Collectors have speculated that if the watch ever came to auction, it would sell for over the $17.75 million paid for Paul Newman's Daytona, because the story attached to it is unlike anything else in watch history. It carries the weight of the Cold War, the Cuban Revolution, the CIA, and the most iconic revolutionary image of the 20th century. But the hammer will never likely drop on this piece. However, what we do know is that a GMT-Master belonging to Carlos Coelho Tuma, Guevara's right-hand man, who died fighting alongside him in Bolivia, surfaced at an auction. And even that watch drew serious collector attention and significant money. Now imagine what Guevara's watch would do. History remembers Che Guevara as a revolutionary, but somewhere in a private home, a man who spent years hunting him still wears his watch. If that's not the most complicated story in watch history, we don't know what is. Now, episode 6 is coming, and trust us, you're not ready for it. See you there.